Hello class, we're on chapter 9 today, and as you see I had a haircut since the last video, so a little bit of time has gone in between chapter 8 and chapter 9. But in chapter 9 we're going to talk about sex and gender, and here are some of the topics that we'll be covering. And the first thing to think about is gender concepts, or the difference between biological sex and gender. So a lot of times we think sex and gender, those two terms are interchangeable, but they're actually not. Sex would be the biological aspect, and you think boy or girl. So when you get married and have a kid, you say it's a boy or it's a girl. There is some ambiguity there sometimes in terms of the biological aspects, but most of the time it's boy or girl. Well, gender is a socially contrived category. So if you remember back in chapter 8 when we talked about race being socially constructed, gender is the same thing. So, and I think the word role, which we'll see a lot in chapter 9, is so think about it like an actor and a role. And so, so you were born a biological male or female, but then you take on these roles, these culturally assigned roles that are expected from you as a male or a female. And as we'll see in this chapter, some cultures have more than two gender categories. So the main thing here on this slide is that gender differences refer to cultural expectations and experiences of females and males. So it's cultural expectations, whereas sex differences refer to purely biological differences. Excuse me. So some animal species, you can't tell the difference really between the male and female of the species. Whereas with humans, there are differences in males and females in terms of physical appearance and biological makeup. So we would say that humans are sexually dimorphic. So if you hear the term sexual dimorphism, it just means that the male and female of the species look different in terms of their physical appearance. So humans are sexually dimorphic, or the females and males of our species are generally of different size and appearance. Now the book gets into that a little bit more in terms of what the differences are, so you can check that out there beyond just your common sense as to what the differences are between the biological aspects of a male and a female in humans. So all or nearly all societies assign certain activities to females and other activities to males. So this is especially true when it comes to division of labor. So excuse me. So males typically do certain jobs, and females typically do certain jobs. Now, in our society, that is becoming less so, where males and females are doing the same jobs. But in non-commercial societies, it's definitely males do these things, females do these things. So not just jobs, but just roles and other activities in general. So gender roles refer to the role assignments for females and males that are a product of a particular culture. So in our culture, males are supposed to act this way and females are supposed to act this way. But those roles or assigned tasks or ways of behaving are different in other cultures. So I talked about, this is something we see as a universal. So again, those are the things that we see in all cultures of the world, or nearly all cultures of the world, is that labor is divided by gender and also age. But in this case, we're talking about gender. So you can see here, this is table 9.1, and so males almost always hunt. That's an example of and this is particularly true in non-commercial societies. Again, you can think about our society. I think I've even seen bumper stickers on cars that say "Women hunt too" or something like that. So think about this definitely more in terms of non-commercial societies. But there are still some gender division in labor here in our society as well. So males almost always hunt. Males usually are the ones that are butchering the animals. Either gender will plant crops. Females are usually the gatherers, and females almost always care for infants. And you can think of some of the biological reasons why that might be, especially in non-commercial societies where they don't have formula and those sorts of things, and they have to breastfeed. So why are females and males generally assigned different tasks? So when we see these cultural universals, nearly all societies are doing this. The next question is, why is that? I mean, this is something within humans that seems more innate in us. The whole nature versus nurture thing, this seems to be more of a nature thing. So the book talks about different theories. One is the strength theory. And so because of sexual dimorphism, males, a more proportion of their body is devoted to muscles. And so one theory is, well, that's why we have this division of labor, because men, have the muscles to do certain jobs compared to women. There's some weaknesses there too, because, it doesn't mean, like say, we saw back a few slides ago about the men will sometimes plant crops or, those sorts of things, or collect honey. Those things don't necessarily require the muscles. So each of these has kind of a weakness to it. So compatibility with childcare theory. So again, I just got done discussing how non-commercial societies don't have formula and things like that. So they have to be there for breastfeeding and that sort of thing. So females might have jobs that are more consistent with compatibility with taking care of young children. And then my favorite, the expendability theory. Men are more expendable than women, and you might think of this in terms of. So you hear that, guys? You're more expendable, but you might think of this in terms of Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, and just the survival aspect and the being able to pass on your genes and that sort of thing. And so you might say that men are more expendable, so they might do more dangerous type jobs like cutting down big trees and hunting wild large mammals and things like that. So here is a picture that shows you kind of the compatibility with childcare theory. So this mother is out hoeing the weeds out of the field and has her baby strapped to her back, and if the baby needs fed or something like that, then she can take a break from her work and do that sort of thing. So this chapter we talk about primary versus secondary subsistence activities. And first, let's go, just the word subsistence means getting food for yourself and your family. And so primary subsistence activities are those that are directly involved in getting the food. So things like hunting, fishing, gathering, herding, farming, that sort of thing. So it's directly there involved with getting the food. Secondary subsistence activities have to do with the processing of that food that you're getting. So whether it's butchering animals, grinding gathered seeds and nuts or something like that, that would be a secondary subsistence activity. So you can talk about the relative contributions to work from females and males, and we hear this a lot in our society of, you can think about subsistence work where you're out doing a job, but then also you've got the domestic aspect. And so although this is becoming less and less so, and men and women are doing the same amounts of work, it's still probably stacked. And I say probably, the women out there watching might say, yeah, it is. But, where women are working outside the home, but then also are doing a lot of the domestic work, so the overall contribution of work might be more in favor of women. That's just in our society, but you can think about it from a non-commercial aspect as well. So in almost every known society, men rather than women are the leaders in the political arena. And in non-commercial societies, a lot of times it's based on kinship, and we'll get into that soon. But for example, the Iroquois are a matrilineal society, whereas they trace their kinship through women. And although still the men play a lot of the leadership roles, because the women are, because of kinship and also their subsistence work, tend to have more say in what's going on, although they're not the formal leaders. And then in warfare, is almost exclusively a male activity, and again, you might tie that back to the expendability theory. So we can talk about gender stratification. So last chapter we talked about social stratification. In this chapter we can look at gender stratification. And so there appears to be variation in the degree of gender stratification from one society to another. And even historically we can see this in our society where before the 1960s, there was a lot more gender stratification in our society than there was after the civil rights movements and women's movement, those sorts of things. So the 60s brought about a lot of change in our culture in terms of gender stratification. We're starting to see less of it, although there's still a ways to go on that. So less complex societies tend not to have this gender stratification. Males and females tend to be more equal. So this would be like your foraging, small bands, nomadic foraging type groups. So in terms of personality differences, so we're kind of getting into the psychological aspects and differences between males and females. And you kind of have to take this with a grain of salt, but recent field studies have found somewhat consistent male-female differences in personality, in that boys tend to be more aggressive, girls tend to be more responsible and helpful. And you might, think about maybe differences in, like maybe because of testosterone is a higher hormone in males compared to females and that sort of thing. But again, you could delve into that a little bit more. And try to figure out why that might be, if it is true. But you can also, there's lots of misconceptions about differences in behavior, and females can be aggressive, males can also be nurturing and that sort of thing. And the book talks a lot about this Six Cultures project, which looked at 6 different cultures and personality differences between boys and girls, and looked at things like dependency and sociability and passivity. As you can imagine, there are different cultures have different views on sexuality and the cultural regulations of sexuality. And again, that has also changed in our culture over time. Whereas maybe before the 1960s, we were a little bit more conservative in how we viewed sex compared to today. So you might think of premarital sex, much more prevalent today, or at least openly prevalent than it was back before the 1960s. Sex and marriage, so there's cross-cultural differences. So don't just think about our society, think about, the book gives examples of other groups and how they view premarital sex, or how they view sex and marriage, when they can have sex, those types of things. Extramarital sex, how permissive is it? How it's typically in most societies it's not something that's welcome, but it just, again, it might depend on the society, and there might be some reason behind why it might be more permissive. And then also homosexuality, which again, if you think about our society, is becoming more permissive than it was before. Reasons for sexual restrictiveness. So if you see a society that is sexually restrictive, research has shown that those societies that are restrictive with heterosexual sex tend to be restrictive with regards to other aspects of sex. So it's usually an across-the-board restrictiveness. Some of the reasons for restrictiveness usually have to do with population size. So if you've got a smaller group of people, and you need to have more stable male-female compatibility and that sort of thing, or if there's a lot of social inequality, certain groups can't get involved sexually with other groups and that sort of thing. So there we go with chapter 9, and if you have any questions, just feel free to email me, and hopefully you got something out of that. Thanks. Bye.